Hello, future doctors. Welcome back to Best Medicine's GCSE AQA Biology lecture playlist. Today, we're starting off with our final chapter, chapter number 7, and this chapter is going to deal with ecology. Before diving into ecology, I'd like to remind you guys about revisions. Reminder of revisions. Keep on revising the previous content. We have covered a lot of content so far, okay? A lot of content has been covered, and I want you guys to go ahead and rewatch those videos multiple times, at least 3 to 4 times, so that you're able to completely know the content by heart before you go into those practice questions, into those past papers. I repeat, do not go into those past papers without perfectly doing the content, okay? So, starting off with ecology, what is ecology? Ecology essentially is a study of communities' interactions with each other and their interaction with the environment. So, what is even a community, right? Did they just throw this word at you and expect you to understand? What is community? Who knows? Let's have a look, right? So let's have a look. Do you know what a species is? Do you remember what a species is? Remember, a species is an organism that can reproduce with one another in nature and produce fertile offspring. Remember speciation, right? A species becomes a different species once it's not able to mate or it's not able to produce a fertile offspring with the original species, right? So species, members of the same species, are able to mate and produce a fertile offspring. Now, if you have multiple species living together, that's called a population. For example, a population of monkeys, or population of elephants, or population of giraffes, and so on. So a group of organisms of a single species living in the same geographical area, habitat at the same time, is called a population of humans. Now, if you have multiple populations combined together, right, that's a community. You have multiple populations combined together. For example, population of elephants, population of lions, population of monkeys, all of them living together in a particular habitat. You call that a community, okay? So therefore, the ecology is going to be the study of communities' interactions with each other. So basically, the populations interacting with one another and their interaction with the environment that they live in. That is their habitat. So many populations living together is a community. Community, a group of different populations living together in a habitat. Now, the environment in which life is present contains the living factors that are alive, such as plants and animals and fungi and microorganisms, right? And these factors are called biotic factors, and you need to know this word, biotic factors. Biotic factors are all the living factors of a given habitat, of a given environment, okay, of a given ecosystem. The environment would also contain the non-living factors, such as soil, water, light, right, wind, landscape, soil again, and these are called abiotic factors, and you need to know this word as well. So what are abiotic factors? What are biotic factors? Will be discussed in more detail in a bit as well, but you should be able to be familiar, you should be familiar with these terms, okay? So biotic factors, living factors. Abiotic factors are non-living factors. Now together, the biotic factors and abiotic factors combined together and interacting with each other, the whole thing is called an ecosystem, right? Ecosystem. So an ecosystem essentially, as you can see in this image, is a community of interacting organisms and their physical environment. So these communities interact with each other as well as their environment. For example, fish are interacting with water. Plants are interacting with air, soil, and water, and sunlight, etc. And so, therefore, they include both living and non-living components. Now, once you have all of these things in the same area, they're going to have competition between them, right? If you're going to have competition in communities, and they would compete for different things, like habitats and food and light. So let's have a look. Competition in communities. Organisms compete for limited resources like food, light, and mates, which affects their growth, survival, and reproduction. And of course, the more adapted a particular species is to win that competition, the more likely it is to survive towards reproductive age and therefore be able to carry on its genes and possibly even evolve. Now, because you have all of these different species, different populations living together at the same time, they're also interdependent on one another. They're dependent on one another for many different things. For example, plants produce glucose, right? Plants produce food. They are the producers. So pretty much everything is dependent on plants to produce food for them. So here's interdependence. Species in a community rely on each other for resources and survival, forming a complex relationships such as food webs and mutualism. Mutualism means mutually benefiting one another. Relationships can also be parasitic, for example, in which there is one is benefiting, the other is harming the benefactor, for example, a leech. But relationships can also be mutualistic, right? For example, both of them are benefiting. So mutualism essentially stands for mutual benefits. An example of this is, for example, when a bird flies into an alligator's mouth, and the bird will get any pieces of food or scraps out, obtaining food, and this kind of helps the alligator clean its teeth. So both of them are benefiting in this case. What is a stable community? You need to be able to understand the word stable community. Often shows up on the exams. They usually give you questions related to this. So you should be familiar with this term at least and be able to intuitively solve questions related to stable communities. They might give you a stable community and then something might be disturbing that community and so on. So what is a stable community? A stable community is one where population sizes and environmental conditions remain relatively constant over time, right? They kind of fluctuate at a mean. So let me just quickly show you. Basically, the way this would work is that you have a stable community. So let's say you have a particular set of individuals, a population of prey, right? This is the prey population that is living in this environment with the passage of time. So this is time, and that's population numbers. And prey is increasing. Now, predator could be here as well. So here's the predator population. As prey population increases, there is more food for the predator population, the red one. So predator population starts increasing as well. And as predator population increases, the prey population is going to start decreasing because the predators are now feeding on the prey. And so the predator population increases. And what's going to happen is that as prey population decreases, shortly afterwards, the predator population also starts decreasing. Do you understand? Because there's no food available. And now the prey population is going to start increasing again, followed by an increase in the predator population, and so on. So it kind of fluctuates about a mean. And that is a stable community, okay? A stable environment. This can, of course, be disturbed by, for example, natural disasters or diseases or new predators or new preys coming in, invasive species, etc. But that essentially is a stable community. Their population sizes remain constant over time about a mean, right? So here's a mean, and then they're remaining constant over time. We label the red one, that's predator population. Okay, awesome. I hope you guys understand this. So next up we have knock-on effect. What is a knock-on effect? Let's have a look at this in this particular photo. So this is showing interdependence in a particular ecosystem. So what you have here is you have plants that are making food through photosynthesis, and then you have multiple herbivores that are eating that food, and then those herbivores are being eaten by carnivores, right? And then they are being eaten by further carnivores and so on. So they are interdependent on each other for food. Now, what will happen if I were to remove one of them? Let's have a look here. So in this particular case, we have a group of species here that are fed upon by many different kinds of species. And these are these rodents, right? Squirrels and rats and rabbits, etc. If I were to use a rodenticide on this, right, to kill the rodents, if these are gone, it's not going to just remove the rodents. It is going to affect, because these are very key species, it's going to affect anything that obtains food from them. anything that eats these rodents, right? The secondary consumers. These rodents usually eat uh, seeds and plants, right? Rabbits and squirrels. And so anything that feeds off of these is going to suffer, like a bobcat and owls and hawks and long-tailed weasels and snakes and pets, and all these animals here, and a mountain lion. And so knocking these off is not just going to affect this particular group of species, but also have a knock-on effect, kind of like dominoes, right? Knocking one domino would knock the next down, and so on, right? It results in a chain reaction. So that is a knock-on effect. If you remove a very key species that is playing a huge role in a given environment, it can have devastating effects on the entire interdependence, on the entire community. So, a change in one species population can cause a cascade of effects through the ecosystem, impacting other species and their interactions. For example, if a new disease kills the rabbit population in the forest ecosystem, well, the rabbits are the prey population. So a lot of things are feeding on the rabbits. And that's going to result in the secondary consumers that's going to eat the rabbits to decrease. The tertiary consumers, which eat the secondary consumers, would also increase. However, rabbits eat plants, those are the producers, they will increase. Okay? Let me just quickly explain to you what primary, secondary, tertiary consumer is again. Producers, right, are those that produce plants. Those that produce food, such as plants. The producers are always plants. Plants absorb sunlight and produce glucose, produce the biomass, produce food. This food is then fed upon by herbivores, by primary consumers that eat the producers. So anything that eats the producers are called primary consumers. And these are usually herbivores. And then anything that would eat those is called a secondary consumer. Anything that would eat that is called a tertiary consumer. Eventually we end up with a particular organism that is not fed upon by another consumer. It just dies its natural death. And that is called an apex predator. Okay? Apex predator. So producers are plants, and then anything that eats the producers is the primary consumer. And then we've got the secondary consumer that would eat the primary consumer. That would be carnivores. And tertiary consumer would again be carnivores. And anything that is not fed upon by a consumer is the apex predator, which dies its natural death and is then decomposed by decomposers. Alright, so let's have a look at some biotic factors first, and then we'll have a look at some abiotic factors. So, again, ecology is the study of interaction of communities with one another, as well as the interaction of communities with their environment. So, in an ecosystem, you would have biotic factors, factors that are living, that come from living things. And these include the availability of food. Remember, food comes always from living things, right? Producers produce food, and then primary consumers are food for secondary consumers. And secondary consumers are food for tertiary consumers, and so on until we go to the apex predators. So availability of food. When there's plenty of food, of course, organisms breed successfully, and when food is in short supply, animals struggle to survive and often do not breed. So that affects the communities, of course. New pathogens and parasites can also affect communities. When a new pathogen or parasite emerges, organisms have no resistance to the disease, and there's a huge rate of deaths among that particular population. New predators arriving. You can have new predators come in. For example, here's a wolf, right? Here's a tiger that is coming in. Organisms that have no defenses against new predators that they're not really used to and have not been adapted to may quickly be wiped out. So these are some of the biotic factors that can affect communities. And so therefore these factors, as well as abiotic factors, they lead to something called interspecific competition. Interspecific competition is that there's competition between species. This can also lead to species outcompeting another. So this interspecific competition, we can also call it as an as a biotic factor, because you have living competition here. So competition between species can lead to species outcompeting another, potentially leading to the decline of less competitive species. So a good example is gray squirrels outcompeting native red squirrels in Britain. and the invasive Japanese knotweed. For example, hippos fight for a water hole to keep it from themselves, right? You would have many different competitions going on. Mountain goats, they go ahead and fight for mates. There's competition about who's the better dancer in pigeons, right? And things like that. Next up, we have abiotic factors. So abiotic factors can also affect communities. Example of this is the light intensity. Remember, light intensity is the most important thing for producers, for photosynthesis. Light limits photosynthesis. So if you don't have light, you're not going to be able to do photosynthesis, and therefore there will be no life to begin with. So light affects the distribution of plants and animals. Plants need light for growth as well as breeding cycles. Temperature. Of course, temperature is very important, right? Temperature affects photosynthesis and growth in plants. It also helps growth as well as functionality in animals, because animals have enzymes and those work at a particular temperature. Here's a little bit of something extra that I've added. Animals that regulate their body temperatures and only survive at specific temperatures, for example, humans at 37 degrees Celsius, these are called warm-blooded animals. Okay, warm-blooded animals are those animals that only survive at a particular set point temperature. They have the ability to regulate, do homeostasis of their temperature. While those whose body temperature changes with the environmental temperature. So there are animals that if they go from a cold place to a warm place, their body temperature is going to become warmer. And if they go from a warm place to a cold place, their body temperature is going to become colder. In humans, that does not occur. Our normal body temperature fluctuates at 37 degrees Celsius because we are able to do homeostasis. So, those animals are called cold-blooded animals. These rely on external heat to regulate their body temperatures. So they don't have their own homeostatic mechanisms like sweating and vasodilation, vasoconstriction, etc. Okay? Moisture levels. Of course, water is important. Availability of water is crucial for life. Water is required for photosynthesis. Of course, it's also required for normal metabolism, for homeostasis, for other chemical reactions, and so on. Soil pH and mineral content. Remember, pH affects the rate of enzyme activity, and minerals are required, especially for plants, to be able to conduct photosynthesis. Remember, magnesium is a mineral that is used to make chlorophyll. Potassium is a mineral that is used for chemical reactions. Nitrate is a mineral that is used to make amino acids, and so on. pH, of course, affects, because pH, too high or too low pH can denature enzymes, inhibiting plant growth. So the levels of mineral ions and soil pH affect plant growth. Low mineral content or acidic soil inhibits plant growth, while soil rich in nitrates, for example, will promote growth. So soil is very important. Then we have wind intensity and direction. Of course, strong winds shape plant growth and landscapes, affecting plant transpiration rates as well. Remember transpiration? Transpiration, if you recall, is the loss of water from the leaves, and that is facilitated by stronger winds. Then we have availability of oxygen. Why would oxygen be important? Well, without oxygen, you literally cannot live, can you? You cannot do aerobic respiration. So, oxygen levels impact the rate of respiration. Do you remember eutrophication? Eutrophication is a very good example of absence of oxygen affecting marine life. Let me just quickly show you. So here's how eutrophication works. So let's say there's a field, right? So here's a field, and then you've got crops in it. And what you've done in this field is that you've put some fertilizer, okay? So you put some fertilizer. Now what happens is that as you wash away this field, some of this water enters a nearby river, okay? Or a lake, or a water body. Maybe let's make a water body here. Here's a water body, and this water eventually washes up together with its fertilizer, maybe from underground or from on top of the ground, eventually into the water body. So once this water body goes ahead and gets some fertilizer, the algae is going to start growing on top of it, okay? So I'm going to make the surface of the water on the right side here from the side. So here's the water, right? And here's the bottom part of the water, the ground level of the water. and you've got some marine plants here that absorb sunlight, and they're able to sort of do photosynthesis and produce oxygen inside the water. So these are marine plants that are inside the water, and they're absorbing the sunlight, and they're able to sort of make this oxygen for fish here, right? So you'll have fish here, for example. So here's a fish, here's another fish, and you're producing oxygen by these marine plants. Now here's what occurs when fertilizer comes in and washes up on top of the surface of water. When fertilizer washes on the surface of water, it's going to promote algae growth. Algae is going to start growing here. When algae grows here, now this light, which was earlier reaching the plants, is not able to do so. So light is not able to reach the marine plants, which means that the marine plants are not able to do photosynthesis. So if they're not able to do photosynthesis, do you think that they will be able to make oxygen? Of course not. If there's no oxygen, these plants cannot survive, and without oxygen, the marine species can also not survive. And that results in a decrease in biodiversity, killing of the species of marine plants. So that's a good example of absence of oxygen affecting growth. And this particular process of fertilizers washing up in water bodies like lakes and rivers, producing algae, and algae blocking the sunlight, resulting in no oxygen, deprivation of oxygen due to no photosynthesis in water bodies, resulting in killing of species. All of this together as a whole is called eutrophication. Okay? Eutrophication. And that is a good example of absence of oxygen killing some of the species. Some invertebrates can survive in low oxygen levels, but most fish need high levels of dissolved oxygen. Okay, and that finishes this part on the abiotic factors. Next up, we want to compare abundance and biodiversity. Before we begin this, we have to understand what this actually means. Abundance and distribution. Abundance means the amount of different species in a given area. So for example, let's just get 2 boxes here. Okay, maybe get 3 boxes here. Because the first box is going to have a lot of different kinds of species. So it has this particular species, that particular species in blue, the red one there, right? And over here, the green one, and so on. This one, the one on the right, only has the blue species and maybe some green species. So this has less biodiversity. This one has more biodiversity. Also, the abundance is greater here. The species number is more abundant here. What about distribution? Distribution tests as to whether or which area of the habitat is a particular species present. So we can use the bottom box as an example. Maybe the blue species kind of lives in this direction. Maybe this is a higher altitude, or maybe this is closer to water. There's a ravine here, whatever it is. And then maybe there's a tree here on the other side, and some species like to live down this way, near the tree, and so on, right? And others just hang around here, and so on. So that's distribution, and we can determine, or we can sort of try to estimate and measure distribution, biodiversity, abundance by a couple of methods. One of the method is the quadrat method that we're going to learn today. So ecologists study the makeup of biological communities and ecosystems. Of course they do that, so they want to test for abundance as well as distribution. They look at how living and non-living factors affect the abundance and distribution of organisms. They also investigate the effect of changes in the environment on the organisms in a particular ecosystem. So to do this, they must be able to measure how many organisms are there and how those organisms are distributed in the first place. So how are they distributed? If you go far away from let's say the river, how does the number of organisms for a particular species change, right? And so on. So one method to essentially get this data is quadrats. So how would you use a quadrat, and what actually is a quadrat? A quadrat essentially is just a wooden, or it doesn't even have to be wooden, it could be made of plastic or anything really. It's a square frame that you lay on the ground in a particular area and count the number of species in it. So let's have a look at an example and try to understand this. Let's say you have two lawns, right? So here's my lawn, my house's lawn, and then here's your house's lawn, right? And you say, you come to me and you say that your lawn is more biodiverse than mine, right? Even though they kind of look the same when we look at them. So you say that your lawn is more biodiverse than mine, or your lawn has more number of different species, or more plant species, let's say, than mine. Could be many different things you could say. So we try to test this out. What we do is we grab the lawns, which essentially are the same size in this example, maybe 5 by 10 or whatever, or 50 by 100. Okay? And what we do is we throw quadrats of 1 by 1 meter at random places. So for example, we throw a quadrat here, and we throw a quadrat randomly lands here, throw a quadrat lands here, and so on. So maybe you throw it up 5 times or 10 times, whatever the number of times we decide to do it. And then what we do is we write down the data and find the mean for the number of species observed. So for example, for mine, I would say, okay, the first quadrat gave me the number of species as 8, right? Here's quadrat, and here's species. The first quadrat gave me the species of 8, and the second gave me 7, and the third gave me 9, and the fourth gave me 7, and the fifth again gave me 9. And so when I calculate the average of this, that becomes 8 species in a quadrat of that I threw 1 by 1 meters in 1 by 1 meter, or 1 meter square of the area. And therefore the estimated total number of organisms in my particular lawn is going to be 8 times the area of my lawn. And the area of my lawn is going to be 50 times 100, right? Length times width is the area of triangle. So area of my lawn is 50 times 100, which is 5,000. So 8 times 5,000 is 40,000. We're going to have 40,000 number of organisms in my particular lawn. And then we do the same experiment at your house. When we do this, we discover that your house has a good average. The first quadrat gives us maybe 12 species, and the second quadrat gives us 13 species. Third quadrat gives us 11 species. Fourth quadrat gives us 10 species, and the fifth quadrat gives us 14 species. And so we calculate the average of this, and the average we get is somewhere around 12, right? We get 12 species per square meter. And so your number of species in your lawn is going to be 12 times the area, which is 50 times 100, and that's 60,000. And so you win the battle. You were right, right? Your lawn, on average, contains more organisms than mine. So that is how we can use quadrats. Now, board examiners want you to especially know how we can improve this particular standard practice, how we can improve this experiment to get better results. Now, one of the ways to do this is to throw the quadrat as randomly as we can, okay? As randomly as we can. So how can we do this? How can we throw the quadrat as randomly as we can? So one way to do this is just blindfold ourselves, right? And then throw it at random sort of places. Or we can ask multiple people to throw it randomly. Or another thing that we can do is plug this area into a computer, into a number generator, and get the coordinates, random coordinates, to plot the quadrat. So we can use those couple of methods, and these are all written in your notes, so you don't have to worry. You can revise them using the notes, and you can write them in your answers. Another very important way to improve your results is to have a greater sample size, okay? A greater sample size of quadrats. So for example, in this case, we have used only 5, but maybe we were better off using 10 or 20, okay? And yeah, so let's have a read of this. That's really it. Quadrats, the simplest way to count the number of organisms is to use a sample area called a quadrat. We often use a square frame laid on the ground to outline our sample area. People refer to these frames as quadrats too. A quadrat with a side 0.5 meter, for example, over here this is 1 meter times 1 meter. That's the one that we used in our example. That gives us an area of 1 meter square. If we're using a 0.5 meter long, then that's going to give us an area of 0.25 meters square. So quadrats are used to investigate the size of population of plants, for example. And they can also be used for animals that move very slowly, such as snails and sea anemones. Here's a lawn, right? And you can put a quadrat in multiple intervals over here, right, over there, using a random number generator and find out the number of organisms. Once you have those number of organisms, then what you can do is multiply the average by the total area. So maybe this is 100 times 20, and you get maybe 6 organisms. Then here's what you do: 6 times, and this is 1 by 1 meter, 6 times, so 6 organisms per meter square, which means 6 times 100 times 20, and we get 12,000. Okay, so 12,000 organisms. So just to emphasize on this, I've also added some examples in your text here, right? We have a similar example here. So again, what you want to really do is to improve the results, and that's a very high yield concept. All the time, they're trying to question you in most papers. They try to question you as to how you could improve the results, how you could improve this experiment. Again, the way to do this is to have a person randomly plot, right? Or have a person randomly throw, or have different people throw it, or blindfold a person and throw it. Or you could have a random number generator that you could use from a computer. Okay, so that's quite a high yield topic, so let's have a look. In AQA, increasing the reliability of your results for such measurements is extremely important and often tested. And so here are some notes to remember. One of the things that you can use is use the same size quadrat every time. And also sample as many areas as you can. For example, in our case, we did 5, right? But you could do 10 or even 20. Increasing sample size gives you a better representative of the original population. For increasing randomness, what you can do is have a person with a quadrat close their eyes, spin around, and open their eyes and walk 10 paces before dropping the quadrat. That's a technique that you could use. You could also use random number generator. So essentially plot the coordinates of your lawn or your sample area and put it in a computer and let the computer generate random numbers and then place the quadrat there. Okay? And you could also ask multiple people to throw it randomly. Okay? So this particular type of reading is called quantitative sampling. So you need to take several random readings, then find the mean number of organisms per meter square, and this technique is known as quantitative sampling. And we can use it to compare distribution of the same organism in different habitats. For example, we did it in your lawn and my lawn, right? We could also use it for one particular type of plant, how one particular type of plant would be present or it'd be distributed in your lawn as compared to my lawn. Maybe a particular type of grass. Another very important method for sampling organisms, especially for their distribution, how the distribution would change across an area, is called a transect. A transect involves laying a line across a habitat. Okay, and then sampling organisms at regular intervals along it to study. So here's how this would work. Let's say here's a lawn, right? And I want to see how the organisms are distributed as we move away from the tree, right? So we have this big tree here, and as we move away from this tree, how are organisms distributed? So what I do is I just plant a line here, right? And what I would do is I would count the number of species at regular intervals. Maybe I count the number of species at 1 meter, right? Whatever's touching in this part here, and then another interval, whatever's touching the line here, and whatever's touching the line here in this particular portion of the line, and so on. Okay? And that would give me a sort of like a result that looks like this. So 1 meter away, right, maybe you have 2 organisms, and then if you're 2 meters away, the organisms that touch the line at that 5 centimeter interval or whatever the interval is, maybe 4, right? 3 meters away, maybe 7 or something like that. Instead of touching the line, what I would personally go with in your answer is to use a quadrat instead, because quadrat is a very standardized sample size, standardized area that you can use to measure and have the same sort of an area that you're using to count the number of species touching that line. So instead of just counting the number of species touching the line, you can just place quadrats at regular intervals. An example of this could be that you place a quadrat at 1 meters, right, and then at 2 meters, and then at 3 meters, or maybe you can even use, instead of using a meter quadrat, you could use a smaller quadrat, like 0.25 meters squared. So you place a quadrat there, place a quadrat here, place a quadrat here, right? Use a smaller quadrat and you get these readings. So examples of these readings you could have is, for example, 1 meter, right, gives you a number of organisms that we're looking for, a specific type of organism maybe, as 2. And then as we move further away, the number of organisms is increasing. And this is an example, just an example, but you could actually link this with science. How? You could reason that as you move further away from the tree is a very big organism, and because it's a very big organism, it's quite settled, and so it's able to sort of take away all the nutrients and all the resources and outcompete the smaller organisms. And so as you move further away from the tree, the plant organisms have a greater chance of having nutrients and resources, right? And so the number of organisms is sort of increasing as shown in our data, right? So they could give you a question like this in which either they give you data such as this, or they ask you to suggest the data based on scientific reasoning and so on. So again, using a transect involves either counting the organisms touching the line or using a quadrat along the line for greater precision. Okay, I personally would prefer that you put a quadrat along the transect in your answer. And next up, we have competition. So remember the definition of ecology? Ecology is the study of interaction of communities with each other as well as communities with their environment. So as they're interacting with each other in the biotic as well as abiotic factors, there could be many different competitions that they have in between each other. So let's have a look at some of them. In animals, competition would involve the following things. For example, food, right? Animals, obviously, food is required for aerobic respiration, growth, energy, and living and reproducing. And so food is a very important thing that you could compete for. Then you got water. Of course, water, again, is crucial for physiological processes like digestion and any other chemical reactions, as well as for maintaining homeostasis. Shelter, of course, shelter, right? Shelter would provide protection from predators and harsh environmental conditions like storms and so on. The reason why you're, for example, even in humans, right, we have our homes and then we're sitting comfortably in our homes, and we're not, because the homes are locked out, or we're locked in our homes, we feel safe from any sort of criminals outside or even wild animals from coming inside our homes, because that's our shelter, that's our safe place. Similarly, animals also have their shelter, which provide them protection from predators and harsh environmental conditions. So they try to compete for shelters. Mates, of course, mates give animals the greatest chance of survival, the greatest chance of reproducing, which would result in a greater number of offsprings, which would ensure that the genes of that particular organism are passed on. Territory secures resources such as food and nesting sites. Remember that if it's your territory, then that's your food and that's your nesting sites, which means that nobody's going to come in here and try to bully you, which means that there is lesser competition, right? If you have territories marked, so this is your territory, that's somebody else's territory, everything here is yours and everything there is theirs, and so you have lesser competition that way. And so animals tend to compete for territory as well. Now in plants, competition can occur due to the following reasons. Number one, remember plants they do photosynthesis. And so you would imagine that plants are going to go ahead and compete for things that are required in photosynthesis. The other thing that plants do is reproduction. And so you would imagine that the other thing that plants could compete for is things that would ensure reproduction of plants. So let's have a look. Number one, plants are going to go ahead and compete for light. Why? Because light obviously is required for photosynthesis. That's essential for energy production. Water, of course, water is another reactant for photosynthesis. It's also important for nutrient transport and, very importantly, cellular turgor. The turgor pressure that is present in plants makes them stand upright, right? Without water, they would just start falling down and they wouldn't even be able to reach for light and so on. Nutrients, of course, remember nutrients like mineral ions such as nitrate ions, which help in making amino acids, potassium ions help in chemical reactions, phosphates, which help in making DNA and RNA. So all those nutrients are very important and they are needed for growth, development, and metabolic processes. Space, of course, because space would ensure the access to light, water, and nutrients, reducing competition. For example, this tree, right? This is a very big tree and it's occupying a lot of space, especially a lot of root space that it would have, ensuring an adequate water supply, adequate nutrients, and so on. Pollinators, remember, plants have to reproduce, and so they also compete for pollinators. Pollinators ensure that the pollen is transmitted from the male part, anther, to the female part, the stigma, resulting in fertilization and therefore enhancing genetic diversity as well as ensuring reproduction. Seed dispersal. This needs a little bit of an explanation, so let's have a look. Seed dispersal. Let's say you have a tree, right? So that's a big tree. It's already well settled here. Now, for this tree to be able to reproduce, it produces seeds. Now, you don't want the seeds to just go ahead and land here. You don't want the seeds to land near the tree because this tree is already settled, and that's going to give very big competition to any small plants that try to grow near it. So you want the seeds to instead go far away from this tree. Somewhere here where there are no plants. And so to make sure that the offsprings have the required resources and lesser competition, larger trees and plants tend to disperse their seeds. So seed dispersal, can occur in a couple of ways. One could be, for example, bird droppings and animal droppings. Like a fruit, right? An animal would come and eat the fruit, and then when it would defecate, it would drop off the seeds in its feces in different places. Another example is wind dispersal. Wind dispersal is that seeds are enclosed in very light packages that are able to sort of be carried around by winds, like dandelions. Another example of animal dispersal is that some seeds are very sticky, so they catch on to the fur of different animals and then are deposited elsewhere. And so dispersal is very important to reduce competition, okay, and colonize newer areas. Now, you would imagine that because we have so much competition, we must have a lot of adaptations, both in animals as well as plants, to be able to outcompete, right? So let's have a look at those adaptations. Animal adaptations. Animals are adapted, for example, for very cold environments, right? Some adaptations that you need to know, and usually they would give you these adaptations in the question, but in case they directly asked you, I have listed some of them here. If they directly ask you, it will be an adaptation that is very, very simple to sort of think about, okay? Usually they would sort of list an adaptation and ask you to identify it from the given information. But if they do directly ask you about an adaptation, it will be very simple. So as long as you do some of these adaptations and get familiar with them, I think you should be fine. Animal adaptations. Very cold environments. If you have very cold environments and you want to survive there, you're going to have adaptations that make you adaptations that keep you warmer. So for example, polar bears. Polar bears have thick fur and a layer of blubber to insulate against the cold. Subcutaneous fat. Remember? In homeostasis, we talked about subcutaneous fat. Another thing is called countercurrent heat exchange, which is not very emphasized in GCSEs, but let me just quickly explain this to you. Basically, you have an artery, right? If this is an artery and that's a vein, remember arteries carry warm blood and oxygenated blood. So if this artery is carrying blood down this way and a vein is present near the surface of the body, the vein is carrying blood down this way. So they have opposite flow to each other, which causes heat transfer from the arteries to the veins very efficiently. Okay? This is called countercurrent, and somehow there's a mechanism that you learn in A levels in which the heat transfer essentially, or any transfer, not just heat transfer, but remember countercurrent exchange would also be present in dialysis. Exchange of anything really is much more appreciated in countercurrent flow. Smaller ears would ensure that there is lesser surface area for heat loss, because ears usually are not supplied with a lot of blood and they're not very well insulated. You could also have, instead of having very cold environments, you could have very hot and dry environments. So in that case, you would need adaptations to conserve water. Example of this would be camels, right? Camels store water not in their humps. This is wrong. In their extra stomachs, okay? Extra stomach. They have fat in there. Yeah. Okay. They have fat in their humps, and that fat can be broken down, metabolized into water, and then they can go ahead and use that water. But camels, more importantly, have extra stomach. There is an extra stomach just for water. That's purely for storing water, and so camels are kind of like the airplanes of the desert. Nocturnal lifestyle. If you have a nocturnal, which means night lifestyle, right? That you're more active at night. Fennec foxes, for example, are active at night to avoid daytime heat. Hiding from predators. So you would also see some adaptations of very hot and dry environments in plants as well in a bit. Hiding from predators. Of course, you want to hide from predators if you're a prey. So camouflage is a good adaptation, right? For example, chameleons are able to change their skin color to blend with their surroundings and so on. Meerkats they're able to burrow themselves and deep under the ground. Rabbits are also able to do this to stay hidden from predators. Catching prey. Of course, you want to obtain food, and to be able to do that, you want to be able to catch the prey. So you want to have a greater speed and agility. For example, cheetahs, right? Cheetahs are very lightweight and they're very powerful. So they have rapid acceleration, very strong jaws. But I think they're the fastest land animals, and so they're able to catch the prey very effectively. Venoms, like snakes, cobras, use venom to immobilize their prey and be able to feed on them. Okay? So many adaptations, right? And we need to just be familiar with them, and hopefully if they ask us, usually they don't directly ask us these, but if they do ask us, then we'll be able to write them down. Okay, mating, right? Last one is mating. One way is that you have elaborate displays like peacocks, right? They're very beautiful, and they tend to attract the females. So that's a male peacock. That's a very beautiful one. They're able to attract females by showing their very beautiful feathers. Okay, vocalization. For example, male frogs produce loud calls to attract females during mating season. Another example is some pigeons. They sing songs. Another example is some birds also have dancing rituals, right? I think it's mountain goats they basically fight for a mate. So stronger one wins and then takes the female. And then we have plant adaptations. Plant adaptations involve most of the time the ability to obtain either water or light, right? Seed dispersal, etc. So to be able to absorb most light, you could have increased surface area as well, or you could have decreased surface area to minimize water loss, etc. Okay, so here are some of the plant adaptations that are listed in AQA syllabus that help preserve water in plants. One of them is reduced leaf size. For example, cacti. If you ever seen a cactus, they have spines instead of leaves, right? And that minimizes water loss, because if you have reduced surface area, then you're going to have lesser gas exchange. Another is needle-like leaves. If you've ever seen pine trees, especially on the mountains, they have needle-shaped leaves. That again reduces the surface area and water loss. Sunken stomata. what is the sunken stomata? Let me show you here. So imagine that instead of the stomata being present at this location here, normally stomata you would find at the underside of the leaf, instead of being here, you put the stomata at this place, right? So when the water vapor escapes, instead of just running off into the wind, it sort of accumulates here just outside the stomata, right? So when it accumulates here outside the stomata, because we have a sunken stomata and it's very difficult to escape out of this, then it reduces the concentration gradient for the water to leave from inside the leaf, right? So you have water here and this water is leaving, but if you already have water outside, then it's not going to leave all that much. And that means that the concentration gradient is decreased, so transpiration rate is lesser. Okay, so sunken stomata help in decreasing the transpiration rate. Let's have a read of this. Some plants have sunken stomata to accumulate escape water outside stomata, which reduce the diffusion gradient, reducing transpiration. Then you also have collecting water systems. Now, you have two different types of roots. You have deep root systems, right, that take water from deeper surfaces, and then you have other trees that are able to sort of have a wide root spread and take water from the surface really, and then they have these divisions between them and interaction in their communities. So some plants are taking water from deep resources, while others are taking from the surface level, and then they divide this sort of water absorption between each other and try to minimize competition. Now, another example of storing water would be that or essentially being able to preserve water is to have inside the plant storage areas that are able to store the water. An example of this would be aloe vera. Aloe vera, probably we're pretty much all aware of what aloe vera is. This is a plant that is popularly used in cosmetics, right? If you have a mom at home or even a grandma, you probably heard of them using aloe vera or something. So they have these succulent tissues. They have thick fleshy leaves. That's just an example that help store water. So many different plants have features like these that are able to help them store water. You could have bulbous stems. For example, baobab trees, right? If you see this tree here, it's a very big one, and in the very thick stems, these swollen trunks as well, they are able to store a lot of water. And then, of course, we have competition for obtaining sunlight. Now, for obtaining sunlight, you could have plants that have a wide area of leaves, right? You could have large leaves. And of course, if you have a larger leaf, then there's a greater chance of, so here's a very large leaf, and then obviously, because it's got a greater surface area, there's a greater chance of it absorbing sunlight. You could also have climbing vines. So usually what would occur in forests, let me just quickly show you here. So here's the land, and then here's a forest. And then in a forest, basically what you have is a bunch of trees that form a canopy, okay? So a canopy essentially is just a sort of a level height of different trees together, and what they end up doing is that they block sunlight. So sunlight can only go through at specific places, okay? So if sunlight goes through specific places, some plants, what they do is they just sort of grow at those places here, for example, right? Here's a plant and it would grow here, maybe a plant would grow here. That's one adaptation. Another adaptation could be that you have very big plants that are able to overcome these canopy trees. So you could have a very big plant that is able to sort of escape the canopy and be able to obtain sunlight. So that's another adaptation. The third adaptation could be that you could have vines. Vines are able to sort of climb these trees and be able to reach sunlight, okay? Here. So you could have large leaves, you could have climbing vines, etc. So let me just go ahead and quickly emphasize on this. In AQA, you might not be directly questioned about the adaptations, right? Might not be, but might is a weak word, right? They might actually do question you from memory or knowledge, but rather be asked to identify an adaptation from a provided text in a question. So essentially the key learning objective here is to be familiar with adaptations so that you're able to answer questions related to them. Now, the better the conditions, the more is life able to proliferate. However, there are some exceptional organisms that survive in extreme conditions. We already talked about this once, but let's just review this again. We call these organisms that are able to survive in these extreme conditions as extremophiles. And do you remember one example of extremophile? Archaea, of course, right? Archaea is a very popular example of extremophiles. So what are extremophiles? Extremophiles are organisms that thrive in extreme environments, such as high temperatures, high salinity, acidic conditions, etc. They have these unique adaptations like specialized enzymes that work at very high temperatures, for example, or very low pHs, that enable their survival in these harsh conditions. In industry, we actually use some of these enzymes that come from these bacteria that live in very hot springs. Those bacteria are able to sort of have enzymes that do not denature at high temperatures. And we take those enzymes from those bacteria and use them in an industry in case in the industry we need to work at high temperatures. These are usually bacteria and more popularly archaea. So bacteria and archaea are usually, but extremophiles can be in any organism that fits this definition, essentially. Okay, but popularly archaea and bacteria are extremophiles. So examples of extremophiles include thermophiles. Thermophiles are those that thermo means heat, right? So thermophiles mean heat loving, thrive in high temperatures, as those found in hydrothermal vents. Halophiles and acidophiles. You don't need to know these terms, but halophile means those extremophiles that are able to adapt to high salinity environments like salt lakes. And acidophiles survive in acidic conditions such as acidic hot springs and so on. Now, you might not be directly questioned about these terms, but you will be questioned as to what an extremophile is and their examples, like archaea especially, right? Most popular one. And yeah, that's it for this lesson. So if you have any questions, just let me know in the comments, and you can buy these notes by contacting through the WhatsApp link provided below. And to get private coaching for your specific needs, if you're doing some other board apart from AQA, if you're doing Edexcel, OCR, CIEs, IGCSEs, if you're doing A-levels, just let us know, okay? And we're here to help. So get private coaching for your specific needs. You can contact us right now using the WhatsApp link provided below. Okay, and you guys have a good one. Happy studying!